Joining us now is one of the most preeminent voices in foreign policy in the world. He is the Wendell Harrison Distinguished Service Professor of Political Science at the University of Chicago, Professor John Mearsheimer. Thank you very much, Professor Mearsheimer, for speaking with us.
My pleasure.
Let's talk about the Russia-Ukraine war. It's going to be 10 months soon since this war began. The last time we spoke in April, you said this is going to be a long war. It's going to be a grinding one. And possibly at the end of it, Russia could eke out a victory of some sort. Where do you see the war right now? What is your best understanding of what is the situation right now, and what may likely give? Because ultimately, this war can't seemingly go on forever. So something's got to give. What may that be?
Well, I think what's happened here is that the war has settled into a stalemate. And the Russians, who envision this as a limited military option, a limited military operation in the beginning, see it now more as a serious war. And they are increasing their forces on the battlefield. Putin has mobilized 300,000+ soldiers. And at the same time, they are destroying Ukraine's infrastructure. They're destroying its energy, its water, and its transportation systems. And in effect, what they're doing is they're wrecking Ukraine. And at the same time, they're continuing to fight these battles in places like the Donbass. But there's no evidence that the Ukrainians are going to lose anytime soon. And in fact, if it looks like the Ukrainians are losing, the Americans and their European allies will up the ante to back the Ukrainians. So I think this is going to go on for a long time. You asked the question, which many people ask, how does this end? I have no answer to that. I don't know. And I don't know anybody who has any confidence that they know how it's going to end. I think you can tell a story where the Ukrainians actually begin to win a battlefield and begin to push the Russians out of Ukraine. And in response to that, the Russians try to rescue the situation by using nuclear weapons inside of Ukraine. Is that likely? I think no. Is that possible? I think yes. I think you can also tell a story where the Russians up the ante, the West loses its interest in supporting Ukraine so forcefully, and the end result is that Russia makes big gains at Ukraine's expense, and the war is eventually settled in ways that point to a Russian victory. Those are two very different outcomes, both possible. Neither is going to happen for sure. So I don't know where this goes from here. I just hope that leaders on both sides are remarkably careful in how they manage this conflict, because the threat of nuclear escalation is ever present, and we don't want to lose sight of that fact.
I'm curious to know if it's got to a stage, this war, where Putin is looking for some kind of a face saver. I think Emmanuel Macron, when he was in the US a few weeks ago, he suggested, or at least he indicated, that Putin needs a face saver. What may that face saver look like, if at all one were to be offered?
I think that logic is flawed. I don't think that Putin's looking for a face-saving outcome here. That argument meshes with or dovetails with the argument that Putin is merely an imperialist, trying to create a greater Russia, and it hasn't worked out very well. He has been unable to conquer Ukraine, and he surely recognizes that. And therefore, if we give him an off-ramp or a face-saving device, he'll take it and we can end the war. I don't think that's what's going on here. Putin views Ukraine as a Western bulwark on Russia's borders as an existential threat. Putin thinks what is going on in Ukraine with regard to Ukraine's moving toward joining NATO, moving toward joining the EU, and cozying up with the West is just unacceptable from a Russian security point of view. And he is determined to either turn Ukraine into a neutral state, and if he can't do that, to turn it into a dysfunctional rump state. And if you look at what's happening now, he is in effect turning it into a dysfunctional rump state. He has annexed 4 oblasts or 4 regions in the eastern part of Ukraine, in addition to having annexed Crimea in 2014. He's not going to give that territory back. And furthermore, he is wrecking Ukraine as a functioning society. It is going to end up as a dysfunctional rump state, or if some sort of arrangement can be worked out, you may get instead a neutral Ukraine. But Putin is not looking for an off-ramp here. What he's looking for is victory. He's looking to achieve his objectives, and he will go to enormous lengths to achieve those objectives because he believes he's facing an existential threat.
I'm just curious to know, because with the war, by launching this war against Ukraine, hasn't Putin only further pushed Ukraine into NATO's embrace? There are many who are saying Ukraine's membership of NATO is just inevitable. And it's not just Ukraine. Now you have neutral countries like Sweden and Finland already on an expedited path to becoming NATO members.
Well, he doesn't care that much about Sweden and Finland. He cares greatly about Ukraine. And that has been very clear since 2008, when NATO first said that Ukraine would become a member of the alliance. The Russians made it clear at that point in time, not only Putin, but his lieutenants, that this was the brightest of red lines. So Ukraine is very special, and he cares enormously about that. Now, there's no question, as you point out, that in the short term, NATO and Ukraine have become closer. But the question is, what does the situation look like in the long term? And Putin is betting here that over the long term, he can either break that bond between Ukraine and NATO and make Ukraine a neutral state, or if he can't do that, he can so thoroughly wreck the country that it's useless for NATO. So that's, I think, what's going on in this conflict.
What do you make of the recent losses of territory that Russia seems to have suffered, whether it was in Kherson, whether it was in Izum and Kupiansk before that? And as a consequence, what are you hearing about voices within Russia? We're seeing a lot more hawkish voices within Russia, suddenly, all of a sudden, questioning military commanders on the ground, saying that the battlefield strategies are all wrong. We've heard also from these quote-unquote non-state actors like Yevgeny Prigozhin and Ramzan Kadyrov, even on state television, hawks like Alexander Dugin and Igor Girkin are suddenly beginning to question not just Putin's strategy, but also military commanders on the ground. Do you see any kind of internal pressures or ruptures which may threaten Putin?
Well, I think that, first of all, the reason that the Russians effectively abandoned 3 big chunks of territory and allowed the Ukrainians to reconquer that territory was because the Russian army was overextended. It could not defend all the territory that it conquered. I think what Putin did was that he rationalized the front lines so that the Russian military had enough forces to defend the lines that were separating the Ukrainian forces from the Russian forces. So I think it was a very smart move on his part because the Russian army, again, was overextended. What he has now done is he is mobilized 300,000+ more troops. And I would imagine over time they'll mobilize even larger numbers. He's put a general in charge who is very competent and who the Ukrainians fear much more than they did his predecessors. So the Russians are now performing better because the front lines have been rationalized and the troop levels are increasing. And therefore, the complaints against Putin have diminished significantly. There's no question that, 2, 3 months ago, Putin was taking a lot of heat for Russia's poor performance in Ukraine. No question about that. But what's happened over time is that criticism has basically gone away or has been reduced greatly. And the Russians appear today to be in much better shape than they were in, let's say, in September or even in August.
You said a moment ago that the bond between Ukraine and NATO, at least right now, is quite strong, but you don't see, I mean, you could envision the possibility that it could weaken over time. Maybe people in America, people in Western Europe will get tired of this war. I'm just curious to know, with the Republican control of the House of Representatives, do you see American funding to Ukraine reduce, or at least, very least, as Kevin McCarthy said, the blank check? We're going to ask some questions about the blank check.
It's possible. I don't think it's likely. The fact is that the United States is so deeply invested in this war at the same time, and that includes Republican elites and Democratic elites. It's very hard for me to imagine us reducing our commitment to Ukraine, which would in effect mean that Ukraine would get defeated. If anything, what we have to do to keep the Ukrainians in the fight is to increase the amount of aid that we're giving them. The Ukrainians are really having a tough time hanging on these days. They're hanging on because we're giving them so much aid. You take that aid away, the Russians will win, and the Americans do not want that. It would be a tremendous defeat for any American president, Republican or Democrat, to be in office when Russia won the war in Ukraine. So I think it's more likely that we will hang in there than we will walk away, or we will begin to diminish our support for Ukraine moving forward.
And one final word, just wondering what ramifications domestic political developments in the US could potentially have going forward in 2023 and then into 2024 on not just the Russia-Ukraine war, but also the China-Taiwan situation. Do you reckon Donald Trump running in if his bid to become the next president were to strengthen, that could have some kind of a rub-off effect both on the war in Ukraine as well as on China-Taiwan, and what may that be? Or do you believe with the Democrats having done better than expected, they certainly have retained the Senate, even the House, they haven't lost by a great majority, that Biden's hand has been strengthened, and whatever he's doing both vis-a-vis Russia, Ukraine, and China, Taiwan, the American people are okay with it?
Well, I think American domestic politics matters enormously for domestic policy. I think it matters hardly at all for foreign policy. The fact is, there is a powerful consensus between the Republicans and the Democrats on foreign policy. When Joe Biden came to office, he did not change Donald Trump's policy toward China. When Joe Biden came to power, he did not change the Trump administration's policy toward Russia. You want to remember that Donald Trump in December 2017 was the president who decided to start arming the Ukrainians. Trump talked about having good relations with Russia and pulling out of NATO and so forth and so on. But in the end, he couldn't do that. The foreign policy establishment beat him back at every turn. And Republican foreign policy looked like Democratic foreign policy. So I just don't think it matters on the foreign policy front. There's no question it matters in terms of domestic politics. Yeah. The blue-red divide is enormously important for what's going on inside of the United States. But in terms of foreign policy, as I like to say, the Republicans and the Democrats are like Tweedledee and Tweedledum. There's just not much daylight between them.
All right, Professor John Mearsheimer, as always, a pleasure speaking with you. Thank you so much for your time and your insights. Thank you.
You're welcome.